Hey guys, tonight we journey back to a time when the world itself seemed to lose its warmth. Imagine waking one morning to a sky that no longer looked familiar. The sun, usually bright enough to cast long shadows across the fields, appeared weak and pale, as if someone had stretched a thin gray cloth across the heavens. Day after day, that strange haze refused to disappear. The mornings stayed cold. The afternoons never truly warmed. Birds flew in unusual directions. Animals behaved nervously. And people everywhere began asking the same unsettling question. Had the sun abandoned humanity? Before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you enjoy slow journeys into forgotten history. And if you find these stories comforting, let me know where you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and together, let's drift into one of the darkest chapters our ancestors ever experienced. Long before weather satellites, scientific instruments, or written climate records, people depended entirely upon the rhythms of nature. Every sunrise promised another opportunity to gather food, tend crops, or travel safely across familiar paths. Every season followed patterns learned from parents and grandparents. Winter arrived, then gradually surrendered to spring. Summer ripened fields before autumn gathered the harvest. For countless generations, these cycles formed the invisible foundation of civilization itself. Then, without warning, those dependable rhythms began to unravel. Historians often describe several terrible winters throughout history, but one period stands apart because it affected not just one kingdom or one continent, but much of the known world. Around the middle of the 6th century, something extraordinary happened. Ancient writers from Europe, the Middle East, and Asia all described unusual darkness hanging over the land. Crops struggled, temperatures dropped, famines spread, entire societies faced challenges unlike anything remembered by those still alive. No one at the time understood what had caused it. Some believed angry gods had hidden the sun. Others whispered that the end of the world had begun. Many simply tried to survive another day. If you had stood in the countryside of what is now Italy during those years, you would have noticed something disturbing almost immediately. Even in the middle of what should have been the growing season, the air carried a chill more fitting for early spring. Farmers walked through fields examining wheat heads that never filled properly. Vineyards produced fewer grapes. Olive trees, usually dependable companions of Mediterranean life, yielded disappointing harvests. Every failed harvest created problems that reached far beyond the farm itself. Bread became scarcer. Prices climbed. Families stretched whatever grain remained by mixing it with roots, wild herbs, or even tree bark. Meals grew smaller. Children complained of hunger more often than before. Elderly relatives quietly skipped portions so younger members of the household could eat. Across the sea, similar worries unfolded. In the eastern provinces of the Byzantine Empire, merchants noticed unusual shortages appearing in marketplaces. Grain shipments arrived late or not at all. River levels behaved unpredictably. Travelers carried alarming stories from distant villages where livestock had begun dying after long periods without sufficient pasture. None of these events seemed connected, yet together they formed pieces of a much larger puzzle. Meanwhile, far to the north, forests experienced their own silent transformation. Tree rings, which modern scientists would later study centuries afterward, recorded years of dramatically reduced growth. Each ring represented a season. Healthy years produced thick rings. Difficult years produced thin ones. Around this mysterious period, countless trees across different continents simultaneously slowed their growth, preserving inside their trunks evidence that something enormous had changed Earth's climate. Of course, nobody living then could read such clues. They relied upon memory instead. Old men sitting beside evening fires insisted they had never seen summers so cold. Grandmothers recalled childhood winters, but admitted even those harsh seasons eventually gave way to warm sunshine. Now warmth itself seemed uncertain. The darkness became one of the most frightening aspects of daily life. Ancient historian Procopius described the sun giving forth its light without brightness, resembling the moon during an eclipse. Another writer, John of Ephesus, spoke of sunlight lasting only a few hours each day before fading into dimness. Though these descriptions may include dramatic language typical of ancient chroniclers, their consistency across distant regions suggests something genuinely unusual had occurred. Imagine trying to plan your work beneath such skies. Without reliable sunlight, farmers struggled to judge time. Travelers found journeys increasingly difficult. Plants that depended upon warmth matured slowly or failed altogether. Every occupation connected somehow to the changing seasons, meaning almost everyone felt the consequences. In Ireland, later chronicles remembered years of failed bread harvests. Chinese historical records described summer frosts and widespread starvation. Accounts from Scandinavia hinted at social upheaval, abandoned settlements, and dramatic cultural changes. Although each community interpreted events through its own traditions, the experiences shared remarkable similarities despite vast geographical distances. For ordinary people, explanations mattered less than immediate survival. One family might sell valuable tools simply to purchase grain. Another slaughtered breeding animals earlier than planned because feeding them through another cold season seemed impossible. Communities that once celebrated abundant harvest festivals instead gathered quietly, counting remaining supplies while hoping next year would improve. Unfortunately, next year often proved just as difficult. The emotional burden cannot be underestimated. Modern societies possess weather forecasts extending days ahead. International trade capable of importing food, refrigeration, preserving harvests, and governments organizing emergency relief. 6th century communities possessed almost none of these advantages. If local crops failed repeatedly, there were few alternatives. Hunger gradually transformed every conversation. People discussed whether more than politics. Parents measured children's health by increasingly visible ribs. Village leaders calculated how long stored grain might last before impossible decisions became unavoidable. Yet amid this uncertainty, life continued. Blacksmiths still repaired plows. Potters still shaped clay. Shepherds guided flocks across increasingly barren hillsides. Fishermen launched boats before dawn, hopping rivers and coastlines might provide what fields no longer could. Human resilience often appears strongest precisely when circumstances become darkest. While villagers focused upon daily survival, rulers faced equally difficult choices. Kings depended upon taxes collected from successful harvests. Emperors relied upon prosperous provinces, supplying armies with food. As agricultural production declined, political stability weakened. A poor harvest rarely remained only an agricultural problem. It became an economic crisis, then a military challenge, eventually, sometimes, a political disaster. Messengers rode between distant cities carrying reports that sounded increasingly grim. Local officials requested tax reductions because farmers possessed nothing left to pay. Military commanders complained about shortages of provisions. Religious leaders organized prayers seeking divine mercy. Some communities held public processions, believing repentance might persuade heaven to restore favorable weather. Others interpreted eclipses, comets, or unusual atmospheric phenomena as signs connected to the strange darkness overhead. Unknown to everyone living through these events, the explanation lay thousands of kilometers away, hidden beneath layers of volcanic rock, deep within Earth's restless interior. But that revelation belonged to a future no 6th century farmer could imagine. For now, all anyone knew was that every sunrise looked weaker than the last. Every harvest inspired less confidence than the previous one, and every approaching winter carried growing fear that the cold ahead might become even more unforgiving than the one already endured. And as another season slowly approached, people across 3 continents prepared themselves for hardships they could scarcely imagine, unaware that the true catastrophe had only just begun. The first signs of another changing season arrived so quietly that many people almost welcomed them. The fields showed faint traces of green once again. Small flowers appeared along riverbanks. Birds returned to familiar nesting places. For a brief moment, hope began to replace fear. Perhaps the strange dimness had finally passed. Perhaps the endless cold had simply been an unusually difficult year that future generations would remember as an odd interruption in nature's rhythm. Yet nature had not finished rewriting the rules. Farmers across the Mediterranean prepared their fields exactly as their fathers and grandfathers had taught them. Wooden plows cut through damp soil, while oxen pulled patiently beneath skis that still looked strangely muted. Seeds disappeared beneath the earth with the expectation that they would emerge into warmer sunlight within a few weeks. Every handful of grain represented confidence in tomorrow, because no farmer willingly buried food unless he believed much more would grow in its place. This year, however, confidence had become fragile. The mornings remained unusually cold. Frost clung stubbornly to grass long after sunrise. Thin sheets of ice lingered on shallow ponds, even when the calendar suggested they should have vanished weeks earlier. Older villagers watched these signs with growing unease. Their memories stretched back through decades of ordinary seasons, and nothing about this spring felt ordinary. Children noticed changes differently. They found fewer insects buzzing through the air. The familiar chorus of birds seemed quieter than before. Streams fed by melting snow rose later than expected, while some hillsides remained streaked with white long after shepherds normally began moving their flocks toward higher pastures. To young eyes, these differences appeared curious. To experienced farmers, they looked dangerously familiar. Throughout the Byzantine Empire, roads remained busy despite the uncertainty. Merchants continued transporting whatever goods they could find between towns and cities. Their wagons carried cloth, pottery, olive oil, wine, and precious sacks of grain. Yet conversations at every roadside centered on the same unsettling observations. Travelers arriving from distant provinces reported nearly identical weather, whether they had journeyed from Syria, Egypt, Anatolia, or Greece. Everyone described unusually weak sunlight, disappointing harvests, and temperatures that seemed trapped somewhere between winter and spring. Normally, different regions experienced different fortunes. A poor harvest in one province could often be balanced by a successful harvest elsewhere. That system had supported civilizations for centuries. But when poor harvests spread across multiple regions simultaneously, the entire network began to strain. The markets reflected this reality almost immediately. Grain merchants became cautious. Instead of selling large quantities, many stored portions of their supplies, fearing prices would rise even higher later in the year. Buyers grew anxious whenever new shipments appeared. Crowds gathered before sunrise, hoping to secure enough flour for their families before supplies disappeared. The wealthiest households managed to purchase extra reserves, while poorer families often returned home carrying much less than they had hoped. Such scenes slowly became common. Far beyond the empire's borders, communities in northern Europe faced even harsher realities. Growing seasons there had always been short. A single cold summer could already reduce harvests dramatically. Now, repeated years of lower temperatures pushed agriculture toward its limits. Barley ripened poorly. Oats matured unevenly. Hay harvests produced less fodder for livestock. The consequences extended into winter. Without Without sufficient hay, farmers struggled to feed cattle through the colder months. Some made the painful decision to slaughter healthy animals before winter began. Better to preserve meat while it remained possible than watch valuable livestock slowly starve once snow covered the ground. Each decision carried lasting consequences. A cow represented future milk. An ox represented future labor. A breeding sheep represented future flocks. Losing them solved one immediate problem, while creating several new ones for the following year. Meanwhile, forests quietly became more important than ever before. Families searched deeper among the trees for edible plants, mushrooms, berries, and game animals. Hunting intensified as villages sought additional food sources. Deer, wild boar, rabbits, and birds all became increasingly valuable. Even then, hunting could never fully replace successful agriculture. Forests offered survival for some, but they could not sustain entire populations indefinitely. Along the rivers, fishermen worked longer hours. Every net cast into flowing water carried greater importance than before. Fish that once supplemented ordinary meals now became central to survival. Coastal villages relied heavily upon shellfish, while inland settlements trapped eels, salmon, trout, and carp whenever possible. Nature still provided. It simply demanded much greater effort. Religious life also changed in noticeable ways. Churches throughout Europe and the Byzantine Empire filled more frequently. Public prayers asked for sunshine, warmth, and abundant harvests. Special fasts were proclaimed in certain regions. Clergy encouraged communities to remain faithful despite suffering they could not fully explain. For many ordinary people, faith offered stability when nature no longer did. If the seasons could not be trusted, perhaps divine mercy remained dependable. Elsewhere, old traditions survived alongside newer religious practices. In remote villages, ancient customs honoring local spirits or sacred landscapes quietly continued. Some believed forests required offerings. Others blamed unusual celestial events. Every culture searched for explanations using the knowledge available to them. No explanation seemed entirely satisfying. In distant China, official court records carefully documented remarkable weather patterns. Summer snowfalls astonished local officials. Frost damaged crops during months that normally supported vigorous growth. Famine spread across several provinces as agricultural production declined. Imperial administrators organized relief wherever possible. Yet the scale of the difficulties challenged even a highly organized government. These reports, separated by thousands of kilometers from Europe, would later become crucial evidence for modern historians. At the time, however, they simply reflected another society struggling through extraordinary environmental change. The atmosphere itself appeared different. Modern scientists studying ice cores and volcanic deposits believe enormous quantities of volcanic ash and sulfur entered the upper atmosphere, scattering sunlight across much of the globe. The people living beneath those skis naturally knew nothing of atmospheric chemistry. They simply observed that sunsets appeared unusually colorful, daylight seemed strangely weak, and the air often carried a persistent haze. Without understanding the mechanism, they accurately recorded its effects. Those written observations would survive for nearly 15 centuries. Back in rural villages, daily routines adapted gradually. Families woke earlier to make full use of whatever daylight appeared. Firewood became increasingly valuable because homes required heating longer into the year. Children gathered fallen branches whenever possible. Woodcutters traveled farther from settlements as nearby forests slowly thinned. Even clothing reflected changing priorities. Wool garments that normally remained stored until autumn continued to be worn well into spring. Blankets became treasured possessions. Homes with better insulation offered obvious advantages, while poorer families endured long nights huddled together around small fires. Despite every precaution, illness increased. Cold weather weakened already undernourished populations. Minor infections became more dangerous. Children and elderly people suffered the most. Physicians, where available, relied upon traditional remedies passed down through generations. Herbal mixtures, warm broths, and careful rest represented the best treatments most communities could provide. Still, many failed to recover. Entire villages began noticing familiar faces disappearing from everyday life. The local baker no longer opened his shop. An elderly shepherd failed to return from the hills. A family quietly abandoned their farm after exhausting every remaining supply. These losses accumulated slowly, almost invisibly, until communities realized they had become noticeably smaller than only a few years earlier. Trade routes also revealed the changing world. Caravans traveled less frequently as merchants weighed increasing risks. Banditry sometimes rose when hungry people became desperate. Roads once considered safe demanded greater caution. Travelers preferred moving in larger groups whenever possible, sharing both protection and information gathered from distant regions. Every traveler carried stories. One described villages where entire harvests had failed. Another spoke of rivers behaving strangely. Someone else claimed that the sun itself had changed forever. Each account sounded unbelievable until another traveler confirmed similar events hundreds of miles away. Bit by bit, people began realizing this was not merely a local disaster. Something immense had touched much of the known world. Yet even amid growing hardship, life refused to stop completely. Children were still born, couples still married, craftsmen still shaped wood, iron, and stone. Musicians still played simple melodies during rare celebrations. Human beings possess a remarkable ability to continue living through circumstances that seem impossible when viewed from a distance. No one could know that these years of darkness and cold were preparing the world for an even greater catastrophe. The weakened harvests had already left millions more vulnerable than before. Food reserves had shrunk. Populations were increasingly malnourished. Trade networks had become fragile, and somewhere beyond the horizon, another invisible threat was beginning its long journey toward the heart of civilization. For many communities, the slightly brighter skies felt like the first genuine gift they had received in years. The haze that had muted the sun began to thin almost imperceptibly. Dawn arrived with a little more light than before, and sunsets lingered a little longer above the horizon. People noticed these changes not because they understood what had happened in the atmosphere, but because hope had become something they measured in small details. A farmer walking into his field one spring morning paused for a moment before beginning his work. The sunlight felt warmer against his face than it had the previous year. It was not enough to erase years of hardship, but it was enough to encourage him to believe that perhaps nature was finally returning to its old habits. Across much of Europe and the Mediterranean, similar feelings quietly emerged. Fields that had struggled through repeated cold seasons showed signs of improvement. Fruit trees produced more blossoms than they had in several years. Vineyards cautiously promised better harvests. Shepherds found greener pasture on hillsides that had remained disappointingly brown during earlier springs. No one celebrated too early. Experience had taught everyone that appearances could be deceiving. Families continued storing every extra handful of grain they could spare. Barns remained carefully guarded. Bread was still divided thoughtfully around the evening table. Children had learned not to waste food, and adults had little desire to return to the careless confidence that had existed before the years of darkness. Survival had changed their habits. Even when conditions improved, caution remained. Merchants traveling between cities noticed another encouraging sign. Markets slowly became more active again. Farmers who had harvested slightly larger crops now had modest surpluses to exchange for tools, clothing, pottery, or livestock. Roads that had seemed quieter during the hardest years gradually welcomed increasing numbers of travelers. Trade had always been the lifeblood of civilization. When merchants prospered, cities prospered. When roads filled with wagons, inns filled with guests. When ports welcomed ships, craftsmen found work unloading cargo, repairing vessels, and manufacturing goods for distant markets. Little by little, that familiar rhythm appeared to be returning. In the great city of Constantinople, warehouses along the waterfront once again received larger shipments of grain from provinces that had managed better harvests. Officials remained vigilant, remembering how quickly shortages had spread only a few years earlier. Government administrators carefully monitored supplies, hopping to prevent another crisis. The capital still stood as one of the largest cities in the world. Its enormous population depended upon constant deliveries of food arriving from every direction. Keeping such a city alive required remarkable organization. Thousands of laborers unloaded ships each day. Warehouse keepers measured grain with meticulous accuracy. Millers transformed wheat into flour. Bakers worked before sunrise, so fresh bread would be ready as markets opened. Every stage depended upon the success of the previous one. Civilization itself resembled a chain in which every link mattered. Further west, the Italian peninsula continued recovering from decades of political conflict, as well as environmental hardship. Villages repaired neglected irrigation channels. Stone walls surrounding fields were rebuilt. Roads damaged by weather slowly received attention once more. Recovery never happened all at once. Some regions improved quickly. Others remained trapped by poor soil, repeated crop failures, or local conflicts. History rarely moves evenly across an entire continent. The same was true beyond Europe. In parts of Asia, agricultural production gradually strengthened after several difficult seasons. Local governments encouraged cultivation wherever possible. Farmers replanted abandoned fields. Markets cautiously expanded as confidence returned. Yet beneath this appearance of renewal, invisible changes were already unfolding. Grain stored in warehouses attracted mice. Where mice flourished, fleas followed. These tiny insects had existed alongside human civilization for thousands of years without attracting much attention. They were unpleasant, certainly, but ordinary enough that few people gave them serious thought. No one imagined they could carry catastrophe. Trade routes connected continents more effectively than ever before. Caravans crossed Central Asia carrying silk, spices, precious stones, and countless everyday goods. Ships linked ports across the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, and beyond. Merchants considered these routes symbols of prosperity. They also unknowingly created pathways for something else. Every sack of grain offered shelter. Every cargo hold provided darkness and warmth. Every busy marketplace brought together animals, goods, and people from distant lands. Civilization's greatest strength, its interconnectedness, would soon become one of its greatest vulnerabilities. Somewhere in Central Asia, among wild rodent populations that had long carried a dangerous bacterium, environmental disruption had disturbed ancient ecological balances. Modern scientists believe shifting climate conditions influenced animal populations, altering relationships between rodents, fleas, and humans. Of course, nobody living in the 6th century understood bacteria, the very existence of microscopic organisms would remain unknown for more than 1,000 years. People interpreted disease through entirely different ideas. Some believed illness resulted from polluted air. Others blamed unfavorable stars. Many viewed epidemics as divine punishment or mysterious acts of fate. Within this limited understanding, they did the best they could. Along caravan routes stretching across deserts and mountains, merchants rarely traveled alone. Long lines of camels carried valuable cargo through landscapes where survival depended upon careful planning. Every oasis offered water, food, and temporary safety before another difficult stretch of travel. These stopping points also became places where countless travelers met. Languages mixed, stories spread, goods changed hands, animals rested side by side. What no traveler noticed was that fleas could also change hosts with astonishing ease. A rat leaving one shipment of grain could enter another within moments. Its passengers needed no invitation. Weeks later, the caravan reached another city. The cargo appeared perfectly ordinary. No official inspecting the goods could have suspected anything unusual. The grain looked healthy. The cloth remained dry. The spices smelled wonderful. Nothing warned of the microscopic danger quietly accompanying the merchandise. Meanwhile, ordinary families focused on entirely different concerns. A mother taught her daughter how to preserve vegetables for winter. A father repaired wooden tools worn out by years of hard labor. Children chased each other through village streets, laughing beneath skies that finally seemed brighter than those of their earliest memories. Life possessed an extraordinary ability to feel normal, even while history prepared dramatic change. In the bustling ports of Egypt, enormous grain ships prepared for voyages northward toward Constantinople. Egypt remained one of the empire's most important agricultural regions, supplying vast quantities of wheat every year. Dockworkers loaded cargo with practiced efficiency. Sailors inspected ropes and sails. Captains studied weather conditions before departure. Cats wandered freely around warehouses, hunting rats that threatened valuable food supplies. Despite their efforts, rodents remained impossible to eliminate completely. Ships offered countless hiding places: barrels, crates, bundles of cloth, coiled ropes. Every vessel became a small floating world where humans and animals shared limited space for weeks at sea. As ships departed one after another, they carried not only food essential for feeding great cities, but also unseen passengers whose presence would remain unnoticed until it was far too late. In villages hundreds of miles away, people welcomed improving harvests with quiet gratitude. Children born during the darkest years now watched fields waving gently beneath brighter sunshine. To them, the frightening stories told by grandparents already sounded almost unbelievable. Could the sun truly have remained dim for years? Had snow really fallen during strange seasons? Had entire harvests failed again and again? The older generation answered with solemn certainty. They remembered every hungry winter, every disappointing spring, every anxious harvest. Those memories would remain with them forever. Yet even they believed the worst belonged to the past. History, however, often moves in unexpected sequences. Sometimes one disaster weakens societies just enough for another to become far more destructive. The years of darkness had exhausted populations across continents. Nutrition had declined. Economies had become fragile. Communities possessed fewer reserves than they once had. The stage had been quietly prepared. Soon, in one of the busiest ports of the Byzantine Empire, a handful of rats would leave the safety of a merchant ship and disappear into the crowded streets. An event so ordinary that nobody paid it the slightest attention, yet one that would help unleash a pandemic destined to change the course of human history. The harbor awakened long before sunrise. Even in the faint light of early morning, the waterfront echoed with familiar sounds that had defined great ports for centuries. Sailors shouted to one another while tightening ropes. Dockworkers rolled heavy barrels across worn wooden planks. Merchants argued over prices before a single crate had been unloaded. Seagulls circled overhead, crying impatiently whenever scraps of food appeared. The smell of salt water mixed with tar, damp timber, grain, fish, and smoke from hundreds of nearby cooking fires. To anyone standing there, it felt like another ordinary day. No one realized history had quietly stepped ashore alongside the cargo. The Byzantine Empire depended upon harbors like these. Every week, ships arrived from distant provinces carrying products that sustained millions of lives. Egyptian wheat filled enormous storage buildings. Olive oil arrived in carefully sealed clay jars. Wine traveled from vineyards scattered across the Mediterranean. Marble, glassware, spices, textiles, wax, honey, and countless other goods flowed continuously between cities linked by the sea. Each vessel represented prosperity. Each successful voyage strengthened the empire. Trade had survived wars, political upheavals, and years of unusual climate. Even after the darkest winters, these maritime connections continued functioning because civilization itself depended upon them. Yet ships transported far more than merchants intended. Hidden deep below the decks, among sacks of grain stacked tightly together, rats searched constantly for food. They slipped through narrow openings with remarkable ease, disappearing behind barrels or beneath folded sails whenever people approached. Sailors disliked them, but rarely considered them extraordinary. Wherever grain accumulated, rodents eventually appeared. It had always been that way. Cats hunted them whenever possible. Traps caught some. Others simply escaped into warehouses once the cargo reached land. Nothing about this seemed alarming. One small rat squeezing through a gap in a wooden crate attracted no attention whatsoever. It disappeared into the shadows beneath the docks before anyone noticed. Within minutes, another followed, then another. The harbor remained as busy as ever. Nearby, grain inspectors carefully examined shipments destined for the capital's immense granaries. Their responsibility was to protect the city's food supply from moisture, spoilage, or fraud. They checked weights, inspected seals, and recorded deliveries with impressive precision. What they could not inspect was something invisible. Modern science tells us that the bacterium responsible for the coming disaster, Yersinia pestis asterisk, traveled primarily through fleas feeding upon infected rodents. When those rodent hosts died, hungry fleas sought new sources of blood. Sometimes they found other rats. Sometimes they found humans. To the people of the 6th century, such a process would have sounded unimaginable. They possessed no microscopes, no germ theory, no understanding that creatures too small to see could reshape history. They noticed only the visible results. Several days passed. Business continued. The markets bustled with customers purchasing bread, vegetables, cheese, dried fish, and fresh fruit whenever available. Craftsmen hammered iron in smoky workshops. Bakers worked through the night, preparing loaves before dawn. Children raced through narrow streets, while stray dogs searched for scraps near busy taverns. Life moved with reassuring familiarity. Then subtle changes began appearing. Workers unloading grain complained of sudden fevers. One warehouse laborer failed to appear for work. Friends assumed he had simply become exhausted after weeks of heavy lifting. The following day, another man remained absent. Soon afterward, rumors spread that both had become seriously ill. Illness itself was nothing unusual. Cities constantly battled sickness. Minor fevers came and went throughout every year. Most recovered after several days. This time felt different. The fever arrived violently. Healthy people, who had been working normally only hours earlier, suddenly became too weak to stand. Their bodies shivered despite warm blankets. Some complained of terrible headaches, unlike anything they had experienced before. Others drifted in and out of consciousness. Family members gathered anxiously beside simple beds, offering cool water and whispered prayers. Physicians examined the patients using knowledge inherited from generations before them. Medicine during the Byzantine era combined practical observation with theories inherited from Greek and Roman scholars. Doctors considered the balance of bodily humors, examined urine, observed breathing, and asked detailed questions about symptoms. They prescribed familiar remedies, herbal preparations, warm compresses, dietary adjustments, occasionally bloodletting. These treatments reflected the best medical understanding available, yet nothing seemed effective. Within another day, many patients developed painful swellings. These appeared most often in the groin, under the arms, or along the neck. The swellings grew alarmingly large. Touching them caused intense pain. Families watched helplessly as loved ones weakened hour by hour. No explanation made sense. The physicians themselves became increasingly troubled. They had encountered many diseases throughout their careers. This one behaved differently. Its speed was frightening. Its mortality seemed unusually high. And perhaps most disturbing of all, people caring for the sick sometimes became ill themselves. Soon, the conversations filling marketplaces began changing. Instead of discussing grain prices or improving harvests, people exchanged rumors. Someone claimed an entire household had fallen ill. Another insisted sailors arriving from overseas carried a mysterious sickness. Others argued polluted air drifting from marshes must be responsible. Everyone possessed a theory. Nobody possessed certainty. Despite growing concern, daily routines continued because they had to. Bread still required baking. Ships still needed unloading. Animals still demanded feeding. Governments cannot simply pause because fear has appeared. The machinery of civilization kept moving. Unfortunately, so did the disease. Weeks passed. The number of funerals slowly increased. At first, each death seemed isolated. Families mourned privately according to long-established customs. Neighbors offered comfort. Religious leaders conducted burial rites. Life resumed. Then funerals became more frequent. Church bells rang more often. Gravediggers found themselves working longer hours. People quietly noticed familiar faces disappearing from the streets. Shopkeepers who had served customers for years suddenly vanished. Port laborers were replaced by new workers. Entire households closed their doors. Those walking nearby sometimes heard only silence from within. In wealthier districts, servants carried news between large homes. Among poorer neighborhoods, information spread even faster. Everyone knew someone who knew someone who had become suddenly ill. Fear traveled almost as efficiently as the illness itself. The emperor's officials received increasingly alarming reports. Administrators initially treated these outbreaks as local problems. Cities often experienced disease. Most eventually subsided. This outbreak refused to fade. Instead, fresh reports arrived from additional districts. More physicians requested assistance. More priests conducted funerals. More citizens abandoned crowded neighborhoods whenever they could. Yet leaving the city offered no guarantee of safety. Travelers unknowingly carried the disease with them. A merchant departing for another town believed he was escaping danger. Instead, he might already have been infected. A wagon transporting perfectly ordinary cargo could also shelter rats. A small boat crossing a nearby river could introduce the illness to another settlement. Every connection that normally strengthened society now allowed the invisible threat to spread farther. Meanwhile, life in the countryside appeared peaceful. Farmers harvested improving crops beneath brighter skies. Children played beside streams, reflecting clear sunlight. Birdsong once again filled forests, recovering from the difficult climate of previous years. Nature seemed determined to heal. Human society, however, was entering an entirely different crisis. The cruel irony could not have been greater. Just as harvests finally promised relief from years of hunger, thousands of workers who should have gathered those crops began falling sick. Fields still required tending. Animals still required care. Markets still required supplies. But healthy hands were becoming harder to find. Modern historians often observe that disasters rarely arrive alone. One crisis weakens a population. The next exploits that weakness. Years of poor nutrition had left countless people more vulnerable to severe illness. Communities that had barely survived the climatic catastrophe now faced an enemy they could neither see nor understand. By the end of those first unsettling weeks, officials no longer doubted that something extraordinary was unfolding. The strange sickness had moved beyond the harbor. It had entered the neighborhoods. It had crossed the marketplaces. It had reached homes of both the wealthy and the poor. And far beyond the city walls, merchant ships were already sailing toward new destinations, carrying grain, passengers, and an invisible companion that would soon introduce itself to ports across the Mediterranean, ensuring that what began as a local mystery would become one of the deadliest pandemics the ancient world had ever known. At first, many citizens believed the outbreak would follow the familiar pattern of earlier illnesses. A wave of sickness might sweep through one neighborhood, claim a number of lives, and then gradually disappear as the seasons changed. Cities had endured fevers before. They had survived outbreaks of dysentery, malaria, and countless infections whose causes nobody fully understood. Experience encouraged cautious optimism. This disease ignored those expectations. Instead of weakening, it spread steadily from street to street. The narrow lanes of the city unintentionally aided its progress. Homes stood close together. Workshops opened directly onto crowded roads, and marketplaces brought thousands of strangers into constant contact every single day. Bakers purchased grain before sunrise. Fishermen sold their catch beside vegetable vendors. Water carriers moved from house to house. Every occupation depended upon countless daily interactions. The city itself was alive. Unfortunately, that same vitality created endless opportunities for the invisible disease to travel. The first physicians who had treated isolated patients now found themselves overwhelmed. Their waiting rooms filled before dawn. Families carried sick relatives through crowded streets. Hopping someone possessed a remedy powerful enough to halt the mysterious fever. Doctors carefully observed each new case, searching desperately for patterns that might reveal the illness's nature. Certain symptoms appeared again and again. The fever arrived suddenly. The exhaustion became overwhelming. Painful swellings emerged beneath the arms, around the neck, or near the groin. Some patients remained lucid for a short time before their strength rapidly disappeared. Others slipped into confusion almost immediately, struggling to recognize family members gathered beside their beds. Many physicians noticed another disturbing detail. People who seemed strong and healthy one day could become gravely ill the next. There was often little warning. This unpredictability frightened everyone. In ordinary times, experience allowed people to estimate the course of common illnesses. A cough might linger for several weeks. A broken bone required months to heal. Childhood fevers often followed recognizable patterns. Now certainty vanished. Healthy neighbors disappeared almost overnight. Parents watched children carefully each morning, searching for the slightest sign of illness. Husbands hesitated before leaving wives who had complained of fatigue. Friends exchanged nervous glances whenever someone mentioned feeling unusually warm or tired. Even ordinary headaches acquired frightening significance. Meanwhile, daily business became increasingly difficult. Merchants struggled to replace employees who had fallen ill. Harbor officials found fewer dockworkers available to unload arriving ships. Blacksmiths postponed orders because apprentices had stopped reporting for work. Builders abandoned construction projects as laborers disappeared one after another. The machinery of urban life gradually slowed, not because anyone ordered it to stop, because fewer healthy people remained available to keep it moving. Religious leaders became central figures in the unfolding crisis. Churches filled with people seeking comfort, guidance, and hope. Long lines formed outside places of worship as frightened citizens asked priests to pray for recovering relatives or offer blessings before illness reached their own homes. Special services were held with increasing frequency. Voices echoed beneath stone ceilings as congregations prayed together for mercy. Candles burned late into the night. The familiar rituals brought emotional strength, even when physical healing remained beyond human ability. Many priests visited the sick personally. They entered homes others had begun avoiding. They comforted the dying. They listened to final confessions. They stood beside grieving families who often found themselves mourning more than one loved one within the same week. Their courage came at tremendous personal risk. Some never returned from those visits. Across the city, cemeteries expanded steadily. At first, existing burial grounds proved sufficient. Funeral processions wound quietly through familiar streets, as they always had. Family members carried simple coffins or wrapped bodies according to local custom. Friends gathered to remember lives now ended. Then the number of deaths began increasing more rapidly. Grave diggers worked from sunrise until darkness. Fresh graves appeared beside older ones, with little space left between them. Workers who buried the dead often found themselves burying colleagues only days later. The emotional weight became almost unbearable. Families accustomed to large gatherings around evening meals now found empty chairs multiplying. A father was gone, then a daughter, soon afterward, an elderly grandmother. Entire generations of memories disappeared within remarkably short periods. Yet the city could not simply surrender. Its enormous population still required food every single day. Grain ships continued arriving despite growing rumors about the mysterious disease. Captains understood the danger, but also recognized that without those deliveries, famine might follow disease. Dock workers, though increasingly anxious, continued unloading cargo because the alternative seemed equally catastrophic. Civilization often survives because ordinary people continue performing ordinary tasks under extraordinary circumstances. One baker still lit his oven before dawn. One miller still turned heavy grinding stones. One fisherman still launched his boat into the harbor. Each small act helped sustain thousands of others. Outside the city walls, news spread slowly but relentlessly. Travelers carried unsettling reports to distant villages. Some accounts became exaggerated during retelling. Others understated the seriousness entirely. Few listeners knew exactly what to believe. One merchant claimed hundreds had died. Another insisted the illness affected only the poor. Someone else argued the outbreak had already ended. Conflicting information created confusion almost as effectively as fear itself. Village leaders debated difficult questions. Should travelers from the city be welcomed? Should markets remain open? Could refusing outsiders protect the community? No clear answers existed. Trade remained essential. Isolation carried its own risks. Communities depended upon exchanging grain, livestock, tools, and countless necessities with neighboring settlements. Closing every road seemed impossible. Leaving every road open felt dangerous. As uncertainty deepened, many households quietly prepared for the worst. Food stores were inspected. Firewood was gathered earlier than usual. Water containers were filled and kept close at hand. Simple herbal remedies were collected from nearby forests and fields. These preparations offered reassurance, even if their practical value remained limited. Doing something, however small, felt better than doing nothing. Throughout the empire, government messengers rode tirelessly between provinces, carrying official reports. Administrators required accurate information before making decisions. Yet, every journey consumed valuable time. By the moment a report reached the capital, conditions in the sending city had often changed dramatically. The empire's vast size became both an advantage and a challenge. Resources existed. Moving them quickly enough proved far more difficult. far away from the great cities, many rural communities still experienced relative calm. Harvests improved compared with the years of volcanic darkness. Children chased livestock across sunny fields. Women baked fresh bread, using grain that finally seemed plentiful again. Life appeared almost peaceful. Those villages could not know how rapidly events elsewhere were unfolding. Invisible passengers accompanied merchants along every familiar road. A single wagon stopping overnight at an inn might unknowingly introduce infected rodents into another settlement. A trading vessel docking at a new harbor could begin another chain of transmission. No army marched across the landscape. No invading fleet appeared on the horizon. The threat traveled silently, hidden within the ordinary movement of commerce that civilizations had depended upon for generations. Modern historians often describe this moment as one of history's cruelest ironies. The same networks that spread ideas, technology, culture, and prosperity also allowed disease to move farther and faster than isolated communities could ever imagine. People had built roads to unite provinces. They had constructed ports to encourage trade. They had celebrated growing connections across continents. None of them anticipated that those remarkable achievements could one day serve an entirely different purpose. By late autumn, the city no longer viewed the mysterious illness as a temporary inconvenience. It had become the defining reality of daily life. Conversations began with questions about who had fallen sick. Markets opened later because fewer merchants remained. Church bells rang so frequently that many residents stopped counting the funerals they announced. Even the emperor's advisors understood that the crisis had entered a new phase. What they still did not realize was that the disease had already escaped beyond the capital's influence. Ships had carried it to distant ports. Caravans had carried it across inland trade routes. Messengers had unknowingly ridden alongside it. Before long, kingdoms separated by mountains, deserts, and seas would begin experiencing the same terrifying symptoms, one after another, until much of the known world found itself confronting a catastrophe unlike any recorded in living memory. As the months passed, fear slowly changed the rhythm of the city. The transformation did not happen in a single dramatic moment. Instead, ordinary routines gradually disappeared, replaced by new habits shaped entirely by uncertainty. Streets that had once echoed with the sounds of merchants bargaining now seemed strangely subdued. Many shopkeepers opened their doors later than before, while others never opened them again. Windows remained closed even on pleasant days. Families stayed indoors whenever possible. Hopping that distance might somehow offer protection against a danger nobody could see. Silence began settling over neighborhoods that had once been full of life. In earlier years, children filled narrow streets with laughter from sunrise until evening. They chased wooden hoops, played simple games, and followed older siblings through crowded marketplaces. Now many parents insisted they remain inside. Some children obeyed without complaint. Others stared through small windows, watching nearly empty streets where only a few hurried figures passed by. Even the city's animals seemed affected by the change. Stray dogs wandered through marketplaces searching for scraps that no longer appeared in such abundance. Cats continued hunting rats among warehouses and alleyways, unaware that they were participating in a struggle far larger than anyone understood. Horses pulling carts moved through quieter streets, their hooves echoing against stone in ways people had rarely noticed before. The city still functioned, but it no longer felt alive in the same way. Inside homes, families developed careful routines. Every morning began with the same anxious questions. Did everyone wake feeling well? Was anyone unusually warm? Had someone complained of pain during the night? A single cough could silence an entire room. A headache that would once have been ignored now attracted worried attention. People had become students of one another's health. Every expression mattered. Every movement carried meaning. The emotional burden became exhausting. Waiting often proved more difficult than action. A family might spend several peaceful days believing they had escaped the illness, only for one member to awaken with fever before sunrise. Hope rose and fell repeatedly, following no pattern anyone could understand. Some households remained untouched, while neighboring homes suffered devastating losses. Others experienced illness, one family member after another. No explanation seemed consistent. This uncertainty gave birth to countless rumors. Some citizens believed certain foods offered protection. Others insisted particular herbs could drive the sickness away. Traveling healers appeared claiming to possess secret remedies inherited from distant lands. Desperate people eagerly listened. Hope itself became a valuable commodity. Whenever someone claimed a neighbor had recovered after using a particular treatment, word spread astonishingly quickly through the city. Yet the recoveries remained unpredictable. Some patients survived despite receiving little medical care. Others died despite every available remedy. Physicians found this especially frustrating. They recorded symptoms carefully. They compared patients. They debated possible causes. Many continued relying upon the medical teachings preserved from ancient Greek and Roman scholars. Balance of the body's humors remained central to diagnosis. Fresh air was recommended whenever possible. Certain foods were encouraged, while others were avoided. Some treatments eased discomfort. None consistently stopped the disease. Despite these failures, doctors continued working because abandoning their patients was unthinkable. Many became exhausted. Some fell ill themselves. Others continued treating the sick, even after losing members of their own families. Their dedication rarely appears in grand historical monuments, yet it quietly saved lives whenever recovery proved possible. The empire's administrative system also struggled under growing pressure. Officials responsible for collecting taxes discovered entire districts unable to meet their obligations. Farmers who had survived years of poor harvests now lacked healthy workers to cultivate their fields properly. Craftsmen produced fewer goods because workshops had lost experienced laborers. Revenue declined, expenses increased, government responsibilities multiplied. Keeping cities supplied with food became more complicated each passing week. The emperor's administrators organized grain distribution wherever possible, hopping to prevent hunger from joining disease as another deadly threat. Warehouses remained under constant supervision. Guards protected valuable supplies against theft born from desperation. Food still arrived, just not always in sufficient quantities. For the poor, each loaf of bread mattered enormously. Those who possessed small gardens inside or just beyond the city walls depended heavily upon them. Even tiny patches of vegetables became precious sources of nourishment. Families carefully protected onions, beans, cabbage, and herbs from both weather and hungry animals. Nothing edible was wasted. Bones became soup. Stale bread was softened in water or broth. Fruit was dried whenever possible for later use. Years of hardship had already taught people remarkable thrift. Now those lessons became essential. Meanwhile, beyond the capital, other cities began sending increasingly troubling reports. The illness no longer appeared confined to one location. Port after port described remarkably similar symptoms. At first, local officials assumed they faced unrelated outbreaks. Eventually, the similarities became impossible to ignore. Healthy workers collapsed after sudden fevers. Painful swellings followed. Deaths increased rapidly. Fear spread through the population. The pattern repeated itself with unsettling consistency. Every report reinforced the same conclusion. Whatever this disease was, it traveled. Merchant vessels remained the most likely explanation, although nobody understood exactly how. Ships visited multiple ports within a single voyage. Their crews interacted with dockworkers, traders, innkeepers, and laborers. Cargo moved continuously from warehouses to markets. Everything appeared interconnected. The sea, once celebrated primarily as a highway of commerce, had unintentionally become a highway for catastrophe. Across the countryside, farmers observed another difficult consequence. The harvest itself had improved compared with previous years, yet gathering it required healthy hands. Families weakened by illness struggled to bring crops in before changing, weather damaged them. Grain sometimes remained standing in fields longer than it should have. Fruit spoiled before it could be collected. Nature had finally become more generous. human society lacked the strength to take full advantage of that generosity. Villages adapted as best they could. Neighbors harvested one another's fields whenever possible. Children accepted responsibilities normally given to adults. Older men and women, despite aching joints and years of hard labor behind them, returned to work because every available pair of hands mattered. Communities survived through cooperation. Without it, many would have disappeared entirely. Monasteries also expanded their role during these difficult months. Monks cultivated gardens, copied manuscripts, cared for the sick, and distributed whatever food their stores allowed. Their disciplined routines continued despite constant danger. Some monasteries became places of refuge. Others became places of mourning. The disease respected neither wealth nor poverty, neither education nor ignorance, neither powerful officials nor humble laborers. Its apparent indifference frightened people more than almost anything else. For generations, status had often influenced one's chances during difficult times. Wealth could purchase better food, sturdier homes, and additional servants. Now even affluent households watched loved ones fall ill. Expensive clothing offered no protection. Large houses provided little comfort once sickness entered their walls. This realization slowly altered how many people viewed the world. If such a powerful force ignored social rank entirely, then every human being stood equally vulnerable before it. By the arrival of another winter, the city had already lost far more people than anyone would have imagined possible only a year earlier. Yet historians believe the epidemic had not even reached its greatest intensity. The invisible chain connecting rats, fleas, animals, cargo, and people continued operating unnoticed. Each new ship entering the harbor carried possibility. Each departing vessel carried risk. And beyond the empire's borders, kingdoms that still believed themselves safely distant from the crisis were about to discover that oceans, mountains, and political frontiers offered far less protection than they had ever dared to hope. Winter returned with quiet determination. Unlike the strange winters that had followed the great volcanic darkness, this season felt more familiar. Snow fell where people expected it. Rivers froze according to long-established patterns. The sun climbed a little higher into the sky than it had during those dim years. Nature itself appeared to be recovering. Human society, however, remained deeply wounded. The colder weather changed daily life once again. Families gathered around fireplaces for longer hours, conserving precious firewood while trying to keep homes warm enough for children and elderly relatives. Thick woolen cloaks, carefully repaired year after year, became essential against the bitter air. Bread baked in communal ovens filled neighborhoods with comforting aromas that briefly reminded people of calmer times. Yet beneath those familiar comforts lingered constant uncertainty. Every knock at the door carried questions. Was it a neighbor asking for help, a messenger bringing difficult news, or someone seeking a physician? The disease had become woven into ordinary existence so completely that even peaceful moments felt fragile. Throughout the capital, public officials faced challenges unlike any their predecessors had experienced. Maintaining order required more than enforcing laws. Entire departments struggled simply because experienced administrators had fallen ill. Records remained unfinished. Messages waited longer to be delivered. Decisions that once required a single afternoon sometimes took several days as replacements attempted to learn unfamiliar responsibilities. An empire as vast as Byzantium depended upon countless individuals performing specialized tasks. One missing official could delay dozens of others. One delayed shipment affected thousands of citizens. Small disruptions multiplied through the entire administrative system. Emperor Justinian continued pursuing his ambitious vision of restoring the former greatness of the Roman Empire. Military campaigns had already stretched imperial finances before the epidemic began. Fortifications required maintenance. Soldiers required food and wages. Roads demanded repairs. Diplomats negotiated with neighboring kingdoms, while provincial governors requested additional resources almost daily. The empire remained powerful, but even great powers possess limits. As disease reduced the available workforce, taxes became increasingly difficult to collect. Agricultural production varied from province to province. Trade slowed in places where fear discouraged travel. Government income declined precisely when public needs grew larger. Financial strain quietly spread alongside the epidemic. In villages far from the capital, ordinary people noticed these pressures differently. Blacksmiths waited longer for shipments of quality iron. Salt, essential for preserving food, occasionally became harder to obtain. Imported pottery appeared less frequently in local markets. Certain luxuries simply vanished from everyday life. Most villagers accepted these inconveniences with surprising resilience. After surviving years of darkness, followed by disease, people had learned to distinguish between necessities and comforts. A sturdy pair of boots mattered more than decorative jewelry. A full grain store mattered more than expensive cloth. Practicality gradually replaced extravagance. Archaeologists studying this period have uncovered subtle evidence of these changing priorities. Household objects were repaired repeatedly instead of being discarded. Broken pottery was carefully mended. Iron tools remained in use long after earlier generations might have replaced them. Clothing patches became increasingly common. These quiet details tell stories every bit as meaningful as royal chronicles. They reveal how ordinary families adapted to extraordinary circumstances. Meanwhile, along the empire's frontiers, military commanders confronted another difficult reality. Armies depended upon healthy recruits. Marching long distances demanded physical strength. Supplying thousands of soldiers required efficient transportation and abundant food. Disease complicated every aspect of military planning. A fortress could possess strong walls, experienced officers, and excellent weapons. Without enough healthy defenders, those advantages meant far less. Some campaigns slowed not because armies lost battles, but because illness weakened their ability to continue advancing. History often remembers dramatic victories and crushing defeats. Less frequently remembered are the countless campaigns quietly reshaped by sickness before a single sword was drawn. In the countryside, monasteries became increasingly important centers of stability. Their stone buildings, gardens, libraries, and workshops represented continuity during uncertain years. Monks cultivated vegetables, copied ancient manuscripts, brewed medicines from herbs, and welcomed travelers whenever circumstances allowed. Many monasteries preserved knowledge that might otherwise have disappeared. They copied works by classical scholars. They recorded local events. They documented unusual weather, harvests, and outbreaks of disease. Without realizing it, they became guardians of history itself. Centuries later, historians would compare these carefully written observations with archaeological discoveries and scientific evidence. Together, they would reconstruct one of humanity's most difficult eras. For the people living through it, however, there was no larger historical perspective. There was only today. A mother worried about her sick son, a farmer wondering whether spring would bring a better harvest, a merchant hoping his next journey would end safely. History is often experienced through intimate moments rather than grand events. In crowded neighborhoods, another change gradually became visible. Some houses stood empty. Entire families had disappeared. Occasionally, distant relatives inherited abandoned properties. Sometimes neighbors simply watched buildings slowly decay because nobody remained to maintain them. Wooden shutters loosened, roofs leaked, gardens became overgrown. Nature quietly reclaimed spaces once filled with human activity. The city's appearance slowly changed, not dramatically, but noticeably. Certain streets grew quieter than before. Workshops remained closed for months. Warehouses stored fewer goods. The pulse of urban life continued beating, though more slowly than anyone could remember. Outside the empire, neighboring kingdoms observed developments with growing concern. Merchants arriving from Byzantine territory described unusual conditions. Some rulers attempted limited restrictions on travel during periods of severe outbreak. Others focused upon strengthening local food supplies, believing shortages posed the greatest danger, without understanding how the disease actually spread. Governments experimented with responses based largely upon observation and experience. Some measures helped by chance, others made little difference. The concept of quarantine, which would become far more organized in later centuries, had not yet fully developed. Instead, communities relied upon common sense, local traditions, religious guidance, and practical necessity. People avoided obviously sick neighbors whenever possible. Families cared for relatives inside their own homes. Travelers occasionally delayed journeys after hearing alarming rumors from distant towns. These actions reflected human instinct rather than scientific understanding. Yet even imperfect responses sometimes slowed transmission. The epidemic also influenced culture in quieter ways. Stories increasingly emphasized the uncertainty of life. Religious sermons encouraged compassion, generosity, and preparation for an unpredictable future. Parents treasured ordinary family gatherings that might once have seemed unremarkable. Simple evenings around a warm fire acquired new significance. Shared meals became expressions of gratitude. Life itself felt more precious because its fragility had become impossible to ignore. As another spring slowly approached, small signs of renewal appeared once more. Snow melted from hillsides. Streams carried fresh water toward rivers. Fruit trees prepared new blossoms. Birdsong gradually returned to forests that had seemed strangely silent during the hardest years. Nature continued its endless cycle. Human civilization struggled to keep pace. Unknown to those watching the first flowers emerge, the epidemic had already traveled far beyond the Byzantine Empire. Merchant ships had carried it westward across the Mediterranean. Caravans had introduced it to inland trade routes. Port cities separated by hundreds of miles were beginning to report the same terrifying illness. What had started as a mysterious outbreak in one region was no longer an imperial crisis alone. It was becoming a catastrophe shared by kingdoms, cities, and villages across much of the known world, ensuring that the coming years would leave scars upon history that would endure for centuries. Beyond the frontiers of the Byzantine Empire, news traveled with remarkable inconsistency. One caravan might report that the great cities of the East had begun recovering. Another, arriving only days later, described entire neighborhoods standing eerily quiet after weeks of relentless sickness. Merchants compared stories around evening campfires, trying to separate fact from rumor. Yet the distinction became increasingly difficult. Every traveler had witnessed something different. Every road seemed to tell a different story. Still, one detail appeared again and again. Wherever commerce flourished, the mysterious disease eventually seemed to follow. The Mediterranean remained the center of an enormous trading world. Merchant vessels crossed its waters in every season that weather allowed. From the ports of Egypt came grain that fed distant populations. Ships from North Africa carried olive oil, ceramics, and agricultural products. Traders from the eastern Mediterranean transported silk, spices, glassware, and luxury goods that had passed through countless hands before reaching European markets. The sea connected civilizations. It also connected epidemics. Sailors rarely remained in one harbor for long. After unloading cargo, they loaded another shipment and departed for a different destination. Crew members visited taverns, purchased supplies, repaired damaged equipment, and spoke with local merchants before setting sail once more. Every stop expanded a network, already stretching across thousands of kilometers. Most voyages ended exactly as planned. A few carried unseen consequences. In the busy port cities lining the Mediterranean coastline, life continued with stubborn determination. Markets still opened before sunrise. Fishermen returned with fresh catches. Potters shaped clay upon spinning wheels. Blacksmiths repaired anchors, horseshoes, and farming tools. Yet beneath that appearance of normality, subtle warning signs accumulated. A warehouse supervisor failed to report for work. A respected merchant suddenly closed his shop. A sailor who had seemed healthy only days earlier developed a violent fever while preparing another voyage. At first, these incidents appeared isolated. Then patterns emerged. City after city began recording remarkably similar experiences. Healthy adults collapsed unexpectedly. Painful swellings developed. Deaths followed with frightening speed. Local physicians recognized the symptoms almost immediately because descriptions arriving from other regions closely matched the illnesses now appearing before them. Although they still lacked an explanation, they no longer doubted they were confronting the same disease. This realization offered little comfort. Knowing the illness had reached other cities simply confirmed its enormous reach. Far to the west, rural communities initially believed their distance from major trade centers would protect them. Small villages surrounded by forests or mountains often received visitors only occasionally. Their isolation had always been considered a disadvantage when seeking rare goods or important news. Now that same isolation appeared almost comforting. Village elders hoped the disease might never arrive. For a while, some seemed correct. Weeks passed peacefully. Harvest preparations continued. Livestock grazed quietly in open meadows. Children collected firewood beneath ancient trees, while shepherds guided sheep across familiar hills. Life retained its comforting rhythm. Then a traveling merchant arrived. Perhaps he carried bolts of cloth. Perhaps he transported iron tools. Perhaps he merely sought shelter before continuing his journey. No one greeted him with suspicion. Hospitality remained an important tradition throughout much of the ancient world. Guests received food, water, and a place to sleep whenever circumstances allowed. Acts of kindness had long strengthened communities. No one imagined they might also invite danger. Within days of the merchant's departure, someone in the village developed an unexplained fever. The illness progressed with unsettling speed. Neighbors gathered to help. Relatives remained constantly beside the patient. The physician from a nearby town examined the sufferer using familiar methods, but found little reason for optimism. Soon another person became ill, then another. The same heartbreaking sequence repeated itself across countless settlements. History unfolded through nearly identical scenes. Families whispered anxious prayers through the night. Church bells rang more frequently. Fresh graves appeared at the edge of villages where generations had buried their dead. The disease showed remarkable indifference toward geography. Large cities suffered first because they welcomed constant traffic. Eventually, smaller communities experienced the same tragedy. Some escaped almost untouched. Others endured devastating losses. Modern researchers believe many factors influenced those differences. Population density mattered. The timing of arriving infected rodents mattered. Weather conditions influenced flea activity. Local patterns of trade played important roles. To the people living through those years, however, outcomes often seemed completely random. One village mourned dozens. Another, only a few miles away, remained almost unaffected. Such unpredictability deepened fear. People searched desperately for explanations. Some blamed unusual weather lingering from previous years. Others suspected contaminated wells. Many believed foul-smelling air drifting through crowded streets carried disease. These ideas reflected centuries of observation, even if they misunderstood the true cause. After all, unpleasant odors often accompanied places where sickness appeared. The connection seemed reasonable. Without microscopes, invisible bacteria remained beyond imagination. Religious processions became increasingly common across many regions. Communities gathered to pray collectively for relief. Churches echoed with hymns asking for mercy. Candles illuminated dark interiors where frightened families knelt together. Faith offered structure when ordinary life seemed increasingly uncertain. Many priests reminded their congregations that compassion remained essential despite fear. The sick still required care. The hungry still needed food. Children who had lost parents still deserved protection. These messages encouraged acts of quiet heroism, rarely celebrated in official chronicles. Neighbors shared bread despite shrinking supplies. Strangers cared for orphaned children. Monks tended the ill, even while knowing the personal risks involved. Such kindness rarely altered the epidemic's course. It did, however, preserve humanity during one of its darkest chapters. Throughout the empire and beyond, artisans struggled to continue their work. A potter might lose his strongest apprentice. A carpenter could no longer obtain enough timber because transportation had slowed. A weaver waited weeks for wool that once arrived regularly. Every occupation depended upon dozens of others. Civilization functioned like an intricate tapestry. When enough threads weakened simultaneously, the entire fabric began to fray. Archaeological evidence suggests that some workshops reduced production dramatically during these years. Coin circulation declined in certain regions. Construction projects slowed or stopped entirely, not because people had lost interest in building, because too few healthy workers remained available. The economy adapted as best it could. Necessity encouraged repair rather than replacement. Communities relied increasingly upon local resources instead of distant imports whenever possible. Luxury became rare. Practicality ruled everyday decisions. Even rulers adjusted their expectations. Grand architectural ambitions gave way to immediate concerns. Feeding populations mattered more than decorating cities. Maintaining existing roads often became more important than constructing new ones. The epidemic quietly reshaped priorities at every level of society. As spring matured into summer, fields once again turned green beneath strengthening sunlight. The volcanic haze that had dimmed the world years earlier had largely faded into memory. Nature seemed determined to restore balance, yet the human world remained caught in a different kind of winter, not one of snow or darkness, but one of absence. Empty homes, empty workshops, empty places around family tables. Each represented someone whose story had ended too soon. Still, life refused to disappear. Infants continued to be born. Seeds continued to sprout. Birds continued building nests beneath the eaves of abandoned houses. Civilization bent under the weight of repeated disasters, but it did not break completely. The greatest challenge, however, still lay ahead. The disease had now established itself across vast trade networks linking Europe, North Africa, and the Near East. It would not simply vanish with the changing seasons. Instead, it would return again and again, reshaping populations, economies, and empires for generations, leaving historians centuries later to wonder how profoundly one invisible organism had altered the course of human history. The first wave eventually began to lose momentum in some regions. No one announced that the danger had passed. There was no single morning when citizens awoke to discover the epidemic had ended. Instead, physicians slowly noticed that fewer desperately ill patients arrived at their doors. Gravediggers found themselves burying slightly fewer people than they had only weeks earlier. Church bells rang less often, though never quite as rarely as before the disaster began. The change was gradual, almost hesitant. People remained cautious about believing it. Many families had already experienced moments of false hope. Earlier in the epidemic, entire neighborhoods had seemed to improve, only for the disease to return with renewed strength days later. No one wished to celebrate too soon. Markets cautiously grew busier again. A few merchants reopened shops that had remained closed for months. Bakers increased production whenever enough flour became available. Fishermen returned to familiar stretches of coastline, bringing fresh catches back to towns where ordinary routines had nearly disappeared. Life always seeks opportunities to continue, even after extraordinary tragedy. For those who had survived, however, the city no longer looked the same. Walking through familiar streets became an emotional experience. Certain workshops stood permanently closed because their owners had never returned. Houses that once echoed with children's voices remained silent behind weathered doors. Gardens carefully tended for generations gradually became overgrown as weeds replaced vegetables. Memory lingered everywhere. A corner where neighbors once gathered every evening. A marketplace stall left empty after its merchant died. A church pew occupied by a different family because the previous one had vanished. History often changes places long before it changes buildings. The physical city still stood. The community within it had been transformed. Officials soon confronted another enormous challenge. How could they restore ordinary administration after losing so many experienced workers? Tax collectors needed replacing. Harbor supervisors required training. Military officers promoted during the crisis suddenly found themselves responsible for larger commands. Government rarely stops functioning entirely. Instead, it adapts, sometimes successfully, sometimes imperfectly. Across the empire, younger individuals assumed responsibilities their parents or teachers might once have expected to hold for many more years. Apprentices became masters sooner than anyone anticipated. Sons inherited family businesses unexpectedly. Daughters managed households under circumstances that previous generations could scarcely have imagined. Entire communities grew older and younger at the same time. Older because so much practical knowledge had disappeared. Younger because new generations suddenly carried burdens once reserved for their elders. The countryside revealed another complicated picture. Fields abandoned during the epidemic slowly returned to cultivation, wherever enough survivors remained. Some villages combined neighboring farms because too few families remained to work them separately. In other places, forests quietly advanced across former farmland. Nature wastes little time reclaiming empty landscapes. Young trees appeared where grain had once grown. Wildflowers spread through neglected pastures. Birds nested inside collapsing barns. To modern archaeologists, such environmental changes provide silent evidence of shifting populations. Pollen preserved in lake sediments reveals changing vegetation. Tree rings record years of unusual growth. Ancient fields gradually disappear beneath woodland. The earth itself preserves memories, even when written records fall silent. Trade also required rebuilding. Merchants who had survived cautiously resumed long-distance journeys. They discovered familiar routes altered by recent events. Certain inns had closed forever. Some ports handled fewer ships than before. Local markets that once welcomed travelers enthusiastically now greeted strangers with greater caution. Trust once lost returned slowly. Communities remembered how disease had traveled alongside commerce. Yet abandoning trade entirely proved impossible. Cities still required grain. Villages still needed iron tools. Salt remained essential for preserving food. Timber, stone, cloth, oil, and countless necessities continued moving across continents despite lingering fear. Civilization accepted risk because survival demanded connection. Medical practitioners reflected upon everything they had witnessed, although they still lacked any understanding of bacteria. Many physicians carefully described symptoms, progression, and outcomes. Their observations, preserved in manuscripts copied over succeeding centuries, became valuable historical sources. Some doctors recognized that close contact often preceded illness. Others noticed that outbreaks flourished in crowded places. Several questioned older medical theories without possessing enough evidence to replace them. Knowledge advanced slowly. Observation came first. Explanation would require many centuries more. Religious communities likewise reflected deeply upon the catastrophe. Monasteries preserved lists of the dead. Church leaders delivered sermons encouraging gratitude among survivors and compassion toward those who continued suffering elsewhere. Acts of charity expanded wherever resources permitted. Widows received assistance. Orphans found new homes. Travelers found shelter despite lingering fears. These quiet efforts helped rebuild societies one family at a time. Far beyond the Byzantine Empire, neighboring kingdoms confronted similar questions. How should abandoned land be redistributed? How could weakened economies recover? Should military campaigns continue after losing so many soldiers? Every ruler answered differently. Some focused upon reconstruction. Others pursued expansion, believing weakened rivals offered opportunity. History seldom pauses after disaster. Political ambitions continue even when populations remain exhausted. Modern historians now understand that the epidemic did not strike every region with equal intensity. Some cities lost astonishing numbers of inhabitants. Others escaped with comparatively lighter losses. Geography, climate, trade connections, and simple chance all influenced outcomes. To those living through the 6th century, however, such patterns remained invisible. They knew only their own experience. One family remembered losing nearly everyone. Another mourned only a single relative. Both believed their story represented the larger truth. Centuries later, scientists would examine ancient burial sites using methods unimaginable to the people of that era. Tiny fragments of DNA preserved inside teeth would eventually reveal the identity of the bacterium responsible for the pandemic. Ice cores would confirm enormous volcanic eruptions shortly before the epidemic. Tree rings from Europe, Asia, and North America would record years of unusually cold summers. Together, these discoveries painted an extraordinary picture. The darkest winter in human history had not been a single winter at all. It had been the beginning of a cascade. First came volcanic eruptions that dimmed the sun and cooled the climate. Then repeated harvest failures weakened populations. Finally, a devastating pandemic spread through societies already struggling to recover. Each crisis amplified the next. None existed entirely alone. For ordinary people, these connections remained hidden. A farmer simply remembered poor harvests. A merchant remembered empty ports. A physician remembered desperate patients. A monk remembered long lists of names copied into fatting manuscripts. Each preserved only one piece of a much larger story. Yet when those fragments are assembled centuries later, they reveal one of the most remarkable periods in human history. A time when nature and disease combined to test civilizations across 3 continents. And although many communities had survived the first terrible years, the plague itself had not disappeared. Hidden among rodent populations, beyond the notice of every survivor, it waited patiently. In the decades ahead, it would return repeatedly, generation after generation, reminding humanity that history's greatest disasters rarely end with a single chapter, but instead cast long shadows over centuries that follow. The passing years did not erase the memory of the catastrophe. For those who had lived through the volcanic darkness, the failed harvests, and the plague, ordinary conversations often drifted back to those difficult times. A grandfather sitting beside a small evening fire might pause while telling a story to his grandchildren, remembering winters when daylight itself had seemed to disappear. An elderly woman kneading bread might quietly recall the seasons when flour had become so scarce that every handful felt precious. The younger generation listened with a mixture of curiosity and disbelief. Children naturally accept the world they know. To them, healthy crops, brighter summers, and busy marketplaces appeared normal once again. The stories sounded almost impossible. Could the sun truly have remained dim for years? Could entire cities really have fallen silent? Could so many people have vanished that abandoned houses stood empty for decades? Their elders answered with quiet certainty. They had seen it with their own eyes. Memory became one of history's strongest survivors. Long after damaged buildings had been repaired and abandoned fields cultivated once more, human experience continued passing from one generation to the next through stories told around hearths, marketplaces, and monastery tables. Not every memory remained perfectly accurate. Some details faded, others grew more dramatic, with repeated retelling. Yet beneath those changes lay genuine experiences shared by millions. Modern historians often compare written chronicles with archaeological discoveries to distinguish memory from measurable evidence. Remarkably, many ancient descriptions, once dismissed as exaggerations, have gained new credibility through scientific research. Tree rings confirm unusually cold summers. Ice cores preserve volcanic ash from enormous eruptions. Ancient pollen reveals changing vegetation. Human remains contain traces of the bacterium responsible for the plague. Independent sources, separated by continents, now support one another. Together, they reveal that the people living through the 6th century described something very real. Across Europe, recovery remained uneven. Some regions regained population relatively quickly. Others required generations. A village losing only a handful of families might recover within a decade. Another that lost half its inhabitants faced a much longer struggle. Fields remained uncultivated. Roads deteriorated without regular maintenance. Wooden buildings collapsed naturally when no one repaired leaking roofs. Nature patiently occupied spaces left vacant by humanity. Forests expanded into former farmland. Wild animals returned to places where human activity had declined. Wolves hunted across valleys once crowded with livestock. Beavers dammed streams flowing past abandoned settlements. The landscape itself quietly recorded demographic change. Archaeologists studying these regions sometimes discover surprising patterns. A layer of occupation suddenly ends. Household objects remain where owners apparently left them. Gardens disappear beneath woodland soils. The absence of artifacts can be as meaningful as their presence. Silence leaves evidence too. The Byzantine Empire also entered a period of adjustment. Although it remained one of the most powerful states in the world, its ambitions increasingly reflected practical realities. Every military campaign required soldiers. Every fortress demanded maintenance. Every public project depended upon taxes collected from productive communities. Repeated disasters had reduced all three. Emperor Justinian I** continued governing an empire of extraordinary size. Yet, historians continue debating how profoundly the pandemic altered his long-term plans. Some scholars argue it weakened imperial finances significantly. Others believe broader political and military pressures mattered just as much. History rarely offers simple explanations. Major events almost always result from multiple forces acting together. Climate, disease, economics, leadership, geography, chance, each influences the others. The darkest winter in human history demonstrated this interconnectedness with remarkable clarity. A volcanic eruption, thousands of kilometers away, altered atmospheric conditions. Cooling temperatures affected harvests across continents. Food shortages weakened populations. Trade networks carried disease farther than isolated communities could manage alone. No single event alone explains the suffering. Instead, countless causes combined into one extraordinary historical sequence. Ordinary craftsmen rarely understood these larger patterns. A potter noticed declining customers. A shepherd noticed thinner sheep. A fisherman noticed changing river conditions. Each observed only a small part of an immense transformation. Together, however, those observations formed history. Centuries passed. Kingdoms rose and fell. Languages evolved. Religions expanded. Empires disappeared. Still, traces of the 6th century catastrophe remained hidden beneath the soil, in forgotten cemeteries, inside ancient trees, within layers of ice accumulating year after year atop distant glaciers. Humanity unknowingly stored evidence for future generations. Then, many centuries later, scientists began asking new questions. Why did tree rings from Europe, Asia, and North America all become unusually narrow during the same years? Why did ice drilled from polar regions contain distinctive volcanic particles dating to the mid-6th century? Why did written chronicles from lands separated by thousands of kilometers describe similar atmospheric conditions? Each discovery strengthened the next. Volcanologists reconstructed ancient eruptions. Climatologists modeled atmospheric cooling. Archaeologists excavated settlements abandoned during the period. Geneticists extracted ancient DNA from plague victims. Disciplines that rarely worked together gradually assembled one remarkable historical puzzle. The picture that emerged astonished researchers. Rather than isolated disasters, they found an extraordinary chain reaction affecting much of the known world. One event increased vulnerability to another. Recovery remained incomplete before fresh crises arrived. Civilizations endured challenge after challenge with astonishing resilience. That resilience deserves as much attention as the disasters themselves. Despite failed harvests, people replanted fields. Despite disease, physicians continued treating patients. Despite economic hardship, merchants resumed dangerous journeys. Despite overwhelming grief, parents raised children who rebuilt communities their elders feared might never recover. History often remembers catastrophes because of their scale. It should also remember perseverance. Most survivors never commanded armies. They never ruled kingdoms. They left no famous monuments. Instead, they performed countless ordinary acts that allowed civilization to continue. A farmer saved seed grain for another season. A blacksmith repaired broken tools instead of abandoning his workshop. A mother shared scarce food among hungry children. A monk copied fatting manuscripts so knowledge would survive uncertain times. These quiet decisions shaped the future, every bit as surely as imperial decrees. Today, when historians describe the 6th century as one of the most difficult periods in recorded human history, they rely not upon legend alone. They rely upon thousands of independent pieces of evidence gathered across generations of research. Ancient writers preserved eyewitness accounts. Scientists recovered volcanic ash. Tree rings recorded environmental stress. DNA revealed the identity of the plague. Archaeology uncovered abandoned communities. Together, those discoveries transformed mysterious stories into one of history's best supported examples of how closely humanity depends upon the natural world. The people living through those years never understood the full chain of events surrounding them. They could not see microscopic bacteria. They could not measure volcanic aerosols drifting through the upper atmosphere. They possessed no satellites, thermometers, or climate models. Yet they observed carefully. They recorded faithfully, and they endured patiently. Their experiences remind us that civilizations are strongest not because disasters never occur, but because ordinary people continue rebuilding after each one. The story of the darkest winter in human history, therefore, is not simply a story about cold weather, famine, or plague. It is also a story about endurance, about adaptation, about communities refusing to surrender, even when confronted by forces far beyond their understanding. And those quiet acts of perseverance ensured that, despite years when the sun dimmed, harvests failed, and disease swept across continents, human history continued into every generation that followed. The generations that followed inherited a world subtly different from the one their grandparents had known. Most of those changes were not immediately obvious. A traveler walking through the countryside several decades after the Great Catastrophe might still see familiar sights. Farmers guided oxen through freshly turned fields. Shepherds watched flocks grazing on distant hillsides. Smoke drifted peacefully from village chimneys each evening. Church bells marked the passing hours, just as they always had. On the surface, life appeared ordinary again. Yet beneath that ordinary appearance, society had quietly changed in countless ways. Families had become more cautious about storing food. Communities placed greater value upon local cooperation. Monasteries expanded their importance as centers of learning, charity, and stability. Governments gradually recognized the necessity of maintaining emergency grain reserves whenever possible. Many of these lessons were never written into official laws. Instead, they became habits passed naturally from one generation to another. Experience often teaches more effectively than instruction. A child who had watched parents carefully preserve every kernel of grain grew into an adult unlikely to waste food. Someone who remembered neighbors sharing scarce supplies during difficult winters understood the value of cooperation long before any philosopher explained it. Memory shaped behavior. Behavior shaped history. Across much of Europe, the population recovered only gradually. Historians estimate that rebuilding communities often required many decades. Every new generation had to replace not only lost numbers, but also lost knowledge. A skilled mason trained over 40 years could not simply be replaced overnight. An experienced shipbuilder carried techniques learned from countless previous craftsmen. Physicians inherited practical wisdom gathered across entire careers. Whenever such individuals died unexpectedly, part of their knowledge disappeared with them. Apprentices suddenly found themselves working without masters. Young farmers cultivated fields using incomplete instruction. Builders solved problems through experimentation. Because those who once possessed the answers were no longer there, progress continued. It simply became slower. Trade routes also evolved. Merchants remained determined to connect distant regions because prosperity depended upon exchange. Silk still traveled westward. Metals continued moving between mining districts and manufacturing centers. Grain crossed seas just as it had for centuries, but traders became more attentive to reports arriving from other ports. Rumors of disease carried greater significance than before. A city experiencing unusual sickness might receive fewer visitors until conditions improved. Although people still lacked scientific understanding, practical observation slowly influenced commercial decisions. Experience taught caution. Along the Mediterranean coastline, ports gradually regained much of their former energy. Shipyards echoed once again with the sounds of carpenters shaping massive wooden beams. Sailmakers stitched enormous canvases destined to catch favorable winds. Dockworkers unloaded cargoes arriving from Egypt, North Africa, and the eastern provinces. Commerce possessed remarkable resilience. It bent under extraordinary pressure. It rarely disappeared entirely. Each successful voyage reminded people that connection remained essential despite past dangers. Meanwhile, the natural world continued following its own rhythm. Forests expanded where human settlements had declined. In other regions, recovering populations cleared new farmland from woodland. Rivers slowly altered their courses through natural erosion. Storms reshaped coastlines. Mountains shed rocks during harsh winters. Nature never remained still. Human history unfolded within that constantly changing landscape. Modern environmental historians frequently emphasize this relationship. Civilizations influence nature. Nature influences civilizations. Neither exists independently of the other. The 6th century provides one of history's clearest demonstrations of that reality. A volcanic eruption altered climate. Climate affected agriculture. Agriculture influenced nutrition. Nutrition shaped vulnerability to disease. Disease transformed economies, politics, and demographics, every stage connected to the next. No single event existed in isolation. Centuries later, medieval chroniclers occasionally referred to stories inherited from earlier generations. Although details varied, memories of strange darkness, failed harvests, and devastating illness survived surprisingly well. Some accounts blended historical fact with religious interpretation. Others mixed genuine observation with folklore. This blending occurred naturally. Human memory rarely functions like a perfect archive. Instead, each generation reshapes stories according to its own understanding. Yet beneath those changing narratives, the central experience remained recognizable. Something extraordinary had happened, something that had tested entire civilizations. Historians working today approach these ancient accounts with careful balance. They neither accept every statement literally, nor dismiss eyewitness testimony simply because it includes dramatic language. Instead, they compare written descriptions with scientific evidence. If a chronicler reported unusually cold summers, researchers examine tree rings. If an ancient author described atmospheric haze, scientists investigate volcanic deposits. If burial grounds suddenly expanded, archaeologists study skeletal remains and settlement patterns. History becomes strongest when different kinds of evidence support one another. The story of the darkest winter illustrates this principle beautifully. No single document explains everything. No single excavation provides every answer. No single scientific test reveals the complete picture. Only by combining hundreds of separate discoveries have researchers gradually reconstructed this remarkable chapter of human history. The process itself reflects patience. Each generation of scholars contributed another small piece. One discovered volcanic ash in polar ice. Another analyzed ancient pollen. Another decoded bacterial DNA. Another translated forgotten manuscripts, preserved for centuries inside monastery libraries. Knowledge accumulated slowly, very much like civilization itself. Perhaps the most remarkable lesson emerging from this period concerns resilience. The people living through these disasters possessed far fewer technological advantages than modern societies. They had no weather satellites warning of volcanic eruptions, no refrigeration preserving food for months, no antibiotics treating bacterial infections, no understanding of microbes, no rapid communication linking distant regions within seconds. Despite those limitations, humanity endured. Communities reorganized. Families adapted. Trade eventually recovered. Agriculture slowly stabilized. Children grew into adults who rebuilt farms, workshops, and towns damaged by years of relentless hardship. History remembers emperors and battles because their stories are dramatic. Yet the survival of civilization depended far more upon ordinary individuals quietly continuing everyday work. Someone planted grain, someone repaired roads, someone copied books, someone taught children, someone cared for the sick, someone buried the dead with dignity. These countless unnoticed actions created the foundation upon which later generations built new societies. Without them, history would have taken a very different course. Today, when scientists and historians describe the mid-6th century as one of the harshest periods experienced by human civilization, they do so because multiple catastrophes overlapped in an extraordinarily destructive sequence. Volcanic eruptions dimmed the sun, global temperatures fell, harvests failed, famine spread across many regions. Then plague swept through populations already weakened by years of hardship. Few eras have witnessed so many interconnected crises arriving so close together. Even so, humanity survived. The world that emerged afterward was smaller in some places, poorer in others, and profoundly changed almost everywhere. But it continued. Every generation since then, including our own, exists because countless unnamed people refused to surrender during those unimaginably difficult years. Their names have largely disappeared from history. Their achievements rarely appear in monuments, yet their perseverance remains one of the greatest legacies left by the darkest winter in human history. If you want to continue the journey, the next video is waiting.